The interstellar research vessel Vanguard 7 drifted silently through the outer rim of the Sagittarius Arm, a lone speck of silver against the infinite velvet canvas of deep space. The ship was a sanctuary of absolute logic, sterile precision, and profound tranquility for its primary inhabitants, the Elari. Having evolved from delicate, avian-like ancestors, the Elari had long since discarded physical survival traits in favor of pure intellectual pursuit. Their slender, hollow-boned bodies were covered in fine, iridescent plumage that shifted color based on their cognitive focus, and they designed every corridor to be bathed in a soft, calming blue light meant to eliminate unpredictable variables. Then, there was Mark. Mark was the ship's chief maintenance engineer, and he was a human. To the Elari crew, and specifically to Medical Officer Vael, Mark was an ongoing, deeply baffling paradox. A lumbering creature of dense muscle, heavy bones, and a high fluid volume who always carried the scent of a bitter beverage he called coffee. The Elari tolerated him because his rugged dexterity was invaluable for repairing complex hyperdrive conduits that automated systems couldn't handle, though they treated him with a polite, distant caution, viewing him as a large, domesticated beast of burden. Every aspect of Mark's daily routine was a source of quiet observation for Vael, who kept meticulous logs on the ship's solitary human. Vael noted how Mark's heavy footsteps vibrated through the deck plates, a constant reminder of the high-gravity death world that had forged his skeletal structure. Despite his imposing physical presence, Mark was remarkably gentle, often lowering his voice to a soft rumble so as not to overwhelm the sensitive auditory receptors of his alien crewmates. Yet, this careful coexistence did little to bridge the fundamental biological gulf between them, leaving the Elari completely unaware of the raw evolutionary traits hidden beneath Mark's calm exterior. The fragile piece of the Vanguard 7 shattered in a single, terrifying microsecond when a localized cluster of dark matter micro-meteorites struck the ship. Traveling at relativistic speeds, a single jagged fragment punched directly through the reinforced hull plating of Sector 4, tearing clean into the lower engineering bay. Instantly, the ship's primary computer overrode the calming harmonic frequencies, replacing them with the harsh, piercing wail of a crimson-red alert as synthetic klaxons screamed across every deck. For the Elari, the biological response to an overwhelming crisis was hardwired into their evolutionary DNA as a survival mechanism developed over millions of years on a remarkably peaceful homeworld. When confronted with sudden, unavoidable mortal peril, an Elari's nervous system did not fight, it surrendered. Across the bridge and the residential quarters, crew members immediately collapsed into a state of voluntary catatonia, dropping their heart rates to near zero and freezing completely rigid to conserve oxygen. Within seconds, the entire ship became a silent graveyard of living statues, frozen in place under the flashing red lights. On the bridge, the helmsman's hands went slack on the guidance matrix, and the communications officer fell back into her bio-cushion with her feathers turning a dull, matte gray. The automated emergency systems were supposed to handle the breach without human intervention, but the kinetic impact had severed a primary data trunk line, leaving the central computer blind to the mounting catastrophe in the lower decks. Medical Officer Vael was one of the few whose specialized neurological dampeners allowed him to resist the immediate urge to faint, though his fine feathers were clamped tightly against his skin in terror. Trembling, his slender fingers tapped frantically at his medical console to assess the ship's vital signs. The main computer reported that environmental controls in Sector 4 were failing rapidly, but the monitor dedicated to the human engineering bay showed erratic, violently pulsing spikes of biological energy. The humans' life signs were not slowing down to conserve resources. They were accelerating at a catastrophic, vertical rate. Believing that Mark was trapped, suffocating, or perhaps undergoing a violent death spasm from atmospheric decompression, Vael knew his duty required him to act. Grabbing a portable medical scanner and pulling a lightweight breathing apparatus over his beak, Vael forced his trembling, frail legs to move over the frozen bodies of his fellow officers. The journey down to Sector 4 felt like a descent into the underworld as the familiar, sterile hallways turned unrecognizable under the flashing crimson emergency lights. Vael's claws clicked sharply against the metal deck plates, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic, deafening blast of the klaxons as he squeezed his slender frame through half-closed bulkheads. Every instinct screamed at him to lay down and sink into the safe embrace of stasis, but the erratic signature on his datapad held his gaze, driving him toward the lower decks. When Vael finally reached the heavy blast doors of Sector 4, the atmospheric seal had automatically locked down to isolate the breach. He hurried to the reinforced observation window, wiping away the condensation to look into the smoke-filled engineering bay. What he witnessed through the glass defied every known law of galactic biology, as the room had turned into a chaotic vortex of escaping air, flashing warning lights, and hissing steam from ruptured coolant lines. Mark was not dying, nor was he incapacitated. He was moving with a frantic, terrifying speed that Vael's eyes could barely track. A massive, 2-ton structural steel bulkhead had collapsed during the impact, pinning a critical plasma stabilization line that threatened to detonate the ship's core. To Vael's utter bewilderment, Mark did not run, but instead braced his thick legs against the deck plating and wedged his hands beneath the colossal metal beam. Letting out a raw, guttural roar that sounded like a predatory beast, Mark physically lifted the 2-ton steel beam off the plasma line, sliding a heavy metal crate beneath it to hold it in place. Vael stood frozen, his beak hanging open beneath his breathing mask as he watched the human grab a heavy-duty plasma torch. Sparks showered over Mark's unprotected arms, burning into his skin, but the human didn't even flinch, continuing to weld a temporary patch directly over the ruptured hull with feral focus. Hypnotized by a mixture of awe and absolute dread, Vael raised his portable medical scanner with a shaking hand and aimed it through the reinforced viewing glass directly at the human. The device took a fraction of a second to calibrate before its digital display completely glitched, overwhelmed by the data it was receiving. When the screen stabilized, it began flashing a critical, high-priority crimson warning text that Vael had only ever seen in military medical manuals. The readouts were utterly impossible, showing that Mark's heart rate had surged past 300 beats per minute, a level that would cause an Elari's heart to literally rupture from hydrostatic pressure. His internal body temperature was climbing rapidly, his blood pressure had spiked to a violent threshold, and the scanner detected a massive, sudden saturation of an unknown, highly complex chemical compound flooding Mark's entire circulatory system. The device labeled the phenomenon as an unauthorized, highly unstable chemical reaction, prompting Vael with a stark warning. Caution. Subject is experiencing a localized, self-induced chemical chain reaction. High probability of synthetic combat enhancement. According to the telemetry, this substance was actively suppressing Mark's pain receptors and forcing his liver to dump its entire store of glucose into his bloodstream, operating far beyond the maximum theoretical threshold of his species. Fleeing from the observation window in a state of sheer panic, Vael scrambled back up the maintenance ladders to the primary command bridge. He bypassed the standard awakening protocols, utilizing a high-frequency medical stimulant to force the captain out of his self-induced catatonia. The captain gasped, his feathers ruffling violently as he returned to consciousness, staring at Vael in utter confusion. Without a word, Vael projected the medical scans he had just taken from the engineering bay onto the main viewer, explaining the human's impossible physical exertion and the volatile chemical compounds saturating his blood. Because the Elari had evolved on a world devoid of apex predators, they had no biological precedent for a physical panic response that resulted in heightened capability. To them, biology was efficient and static. The only logical conclusion they could reach based on the data was deeply sinister. Earth had hidden the true nature of its citizens from the Galactic Council. Mark was not a civilian engineer, he was a sleeper agent, a genetically modified biological weapon deployed by humanity under the guise of an ordinary laborer. The micro-meteorite crisis hadn't just damaged the ship, it had accidentally triggered the humans' combat activation protocol. Horrified by Vael's presentation and convinced that a dangerous, activated biological weapon was roaming free in the belly of his ship, the captain acted instantly. He slammed his palm against the emergency console, overriding the standard automated repair subroutines. Initiate complete Level 9 sector lockdown, the captain commanded, his voice trembling. Seal all structural bulkheads surrounding Sector 4. Down below, heavy, foot-thick titanium blast doors slammed shut with a deafening hydraulic crash, trapping Mark entirely within the ruined engineering bay. On the bridge, the captain and Vael watched the security feeds with bated breath as the camera showed Mark pacing frantically back and forth across the deck, sweating profusely and shaking his hands violently while muttering low, incoherent phrases. To the watching Elari, this behavior looked incredibly ominous, interpreting his frantic movements as an unstable chemical payload struggling to maintain structural integrity before an inevitable explosion. The video feed captured Mark kicking a fallen piece of machinery out of his path, sending the heavy chunk of metal flying across the room with terrifying force. On the bridge, the officers flinched, convinced his psychological matrix was deteriorating into an uncontrollable battle rage. The captain took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down his terrified feathers, and activated the localized intercom channel leading directly into the sealed engineering bay. His voice, magnified by the ship's audio systems, echoed through the smoke-filled room. "Specialist Mark," the captain announced, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his tone. "You are commanded to step away from the primary system controls immediately." Inside the bay, Mark stopped pacing and looked up at the security camera with an expression of profound confusion. "Captain?" Mark asked, his voice rough and raspy. "What's going on? Why did the blast doors seal? I patched the primary plasma line, the hull breach is contained, but the manual controls are completely dead down here." The captain tightened his grip on the console, refusing to believe the human civilian persona. "Do not attempt to deceive us, Terran. We have analyzed your medical telemetry and know what you are. Step away from the consoles, or we will be forced to vent the atmosphere of your sector. Identify the nature of your weaponized payload immediately." Inside the smoke-stained engineering bay, the immediate, life-threatening danger had fully passed, and Mark's body reached its natural limit. The intense survival response that had granted him superhuman strength began to recede, bringing with it the inevitable, brutal reality of the adrenaline crash. Suddenly, Mark's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto his knees, his entire body shaking violently. He slumped against a metal console, gasping heavily for air as his skin rapidly turned from a flushed crimson to a pale, ghostly white as his blood vessels constricted. Up on the bridge, the alien crew erupted into sheer panic as the main monitors showed the volatile chemical levels in Mark's blood plunging rapidly while his nervous system entered a state of massive, chaotic tremors. "Captain, the weapon's internal core is destabilizing," Vael yelled, his fingers hovering over the emergency atmospheric purge valve. Mark, hearing the frantic, terrified accusations still blaring over the open intercom, looked directly at the security camera. Despite his exhaustion and the violent shaking of his hands, he let out a low, tired, and thoroughly rugged laugh that echoed strangely through the ship. You guys think I'm a bioweapon?" Mark gasped out, wiping cold sweat from his forehead as he leaned against the console. "It's called adrenaline, Captain. My species didn't grow up on a peaceful paradise. Earth is a high-gravity death world filled with things that wanted to eat us, so nature built a survival switch directly into our organs." Mark forced himself to sit up, holding up a shaking hand to the camera to explain how the natural chemical cocktail shuts off pain receptors and forces muscles past their physical limits during times of fear. On the bridge, absolute silence fell over the Elari crew as Vael stared at the data, slowly realizing the terrifying truth. The human wasn't a manufactured soldier, but a creature naturally equipped with a built-in survival mechanism. The lockdown was slowly lifted, and the heavy titanium blast doors retracted to allow Vael to cautiously enter the engineering bay with a blanket and a stabilizing nutrient solution. Mark accepted them with a weak smile, his pulse stabilizing back to its normal human baseline as his body naturally repaired its own chemical balance. Later that evening, Vael opened the official Galactic Council Encyclopedia and added a new, high-priority medical advisory to the top of the human file. Extreme caution advised. Do not corner, do not startle, and under no circumstances threaten a human. Their biology is a self-manufacturing weapon. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.